BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, everybody. Today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays this year, I've been talking to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery. And in this episode, I will be revisiting the Jack the Ripper suspect, Charles Allen Lechmere. And when I say revisiting, I mean that this is the third episode that I've done that's talked about Charles Lechmere, and I would like to give a shout out to Christer Holmgren, who is the author of Cutting Point, and you may have also seen him in the documentary The Missing Evidence, talking about Charles Lechmere as not only a Jack the Ripper suspect, but also a suspect in the Thames torso murders, which we will go through in today's episode. And Christer Holmgren was kind enough to check out Black Box Online Radio, and he wrote out a very lengthy comment, which is an essay in itself, which I will be responding to. But it's been almost 2 years since I've done my episodes on Charles Lechmere. I did a part 1, and then I did a part 2, which was more or less a Q&A session, where I was mostly responding to the material from a different ripperologist, Edward Stowe, and his videos on the House of Lechmere channel. And before we truly get into Christer Holmgren's comments, I would also like to just provide a little bit of basic material about Jack the Ripper. The Ripper was a serial killer who operated in England in 1888. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. The first confirmed crime attributed to Jack the Ripper was on August 31st of 1888 with the murder of Polly Nichols. Then on September 8th, we had the murder of Annie Chapman. On September 30th, we had the double event, which saw the deaths of Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes. So that's about a 3-week gap from Annie Chapman to the double event, and then there is a 5-week gap to the murder of Mary Kelly, the final confirmed victim of the Ripper, which occurred on November 9th of 1888. And I've discussed this on a lot of different Ripper Wednesday episodes, and I'm just simply asking the question, does it not seem peculiar that there is this 5-week gap in between the murders of Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes and the murder of Mary Kelly? And I have to give a shout out to Airborne 1979, who is providing a possibility. And I'm just going to read off this comment here. I think the reason why there is such a long gap between the double event and Mary Kelly is 2 things. Number 1, the area was flooded with police, and they were doing door-to-door inquiries, and I think the police got very close to him. Another possibility might be that he cut or hurt himself during the attack on Catherine Eddowes. And Airborne 1979, I think that is an absolutely brilliant comment, because, I listen back to old episodes of Black Box Online Radio, and believe it or not, out of any episode that I've done this year, whether it's the Zodiac Killer episodes, the D.B. Cooper episodes, or the Ripper ones, the episode that I listen back to the most is the one that I did called the Jack the Ripper Timeline, where I was mostly discussing a book called Jack the Ripper by Peter Foreman, but he had some very good analyses on the timeline of events. And the most interesting aspect of his book was when he talks about how there is a large amount of time that just appears to be unaccounted for after the murder of Catherine Eddowes, the 4th victim, and a message that is written on a wall called the Goulston Street graffiti, which says something to the effect of, the Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing, or the Jews are not the men that will be blamed for nothing. And when I say something to that effect, we aren't 100% sure because it was not photographed, and people are relying on secondhand sources no matter what we're doing with it. But in terms of the timeline and the gaps, one possible theory is just what Airborne has listed off, that the Ripper committed 2 murders. He murdered Liz Stride at approximately 12:58 a.m., and then the murder of Catherine Eddowes could have taken place, about 30 minutes later, so then that would be 1:30 a.m., but then the Goulston Street graffiti doesn't appear until, we're talking 2:25 to 2:59 a.m., according to Peter Foreman's timeline. And one thing that is discussed is that maybe the Ripper cut himself during the murder of Catherine Eddowes, which was a very vicious murder. That was a very clear escalation in violence compared to the murder of Annie Chapman, because Catherine Eddowes also had her face mutilated, and then the Ripper could have been hiding in the alcoves, or he could have been hiding in a particular spot where he is just trying to perhaps stop the bleeding on his hand. And the evidence for this is that an apron, or a portion of an apron, was taken from Catherine Eddowes' body, and the apron was dropped by the Goulston Street graffito. So some people think that the Ripper is trying to stop the bleeding, but I haven't heard this mentioned in any of the other sources, and it's something that I'm thinking about. What if the Ripper just had some type of emotional crash? What if he had a big adrenaline spike and he just committed two murders? And he murdered Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes, and then he has perhaps lost some of his energy and he's catching his breath, and he just finds a little hiding spot and he's trying to stop the bleeding on his hand. Then he exits and writes the Goulston Street graffito around 2:25 a.m. on September 30th, 1888, and then he goes, much as Airborne would have said, into hiding, thinks there's a big police presence, and this is all done in a calculated way, because this really goes to show that if any of those things are true, if any of those fragments of theories are true, then the Ripper would have known exactly what he was doing, and he would not have been a clinical psychotic. But just giving a shout out. And one more time, if you have anything to say about Jack the Ripper, you can put your ideas in the comments section down below, and anything is appreciated that's relevant to the mystery, much as Airborne 1979 did. And you can also hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And you can always go over to the Facebook page for Black Box Online Radio. I also have an Instagram page, blackboxonlineradio. You can go through some of the links in the description box. One of them is for the Spotify channel, and you can download the audio version of this show for free on Spotify and anywhere you get your podcasts under the names Black Box True Crime or Black Box Podcast. And a great way to support all of these efforts is by going to buymeacoffee.com, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And this weekend on Black Box Online Radio, there will be a new episode in the White Horse Killer Saga. I write a series of fictional stories called the White Horse Killer Saga, and it's based on the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. And I am on the fourth book now, The Eyes of the White Horse, and there will be a new episode coming out this weekend. And right now I would like to look at the comments that were made by Christer Holmgren, author of Cutting Point, who has Jack the Ripper, who has Charles Lechmere as a Jack the Ripper suspect, as well as a suspect in the Thames torso murders. Charles Lechmere was born in 1849 and he passed away in 1920. So he would have actually been 40 years old at the start of the Autumn of Terror, and his birthday was on October 5th, so during the Autumn of Terror he's going to go from 40 to 41 years old. I think that this is a little bit old for a Jack the Ripper suspect, but I mean, it's not completely impossible. I'm just looking at some of the witness descriptions and the estimations, and they put Jack the Ripper at a little bit younger. We're talking late 20s, early 30s, maybe even mid 30s, if you look at the at some of the questionable witness statements, but I don't want to get too sidetracked. But 40 years old is not out of the question, especially not if people are going to be entertaining suspects that are in their 50s like Lewis Carroll, or even in their 70s like Sir William Gull. But one of the points, though, that I was talking about in my first episode on Charles Lechmere is that he becomes a suspect because of the murder of Polly Nichols, and his place in the history of Ripperology and the world of Jack the Ripper and British crime history is he is the person who found the body of Polly Nichols, the first victim of Jack the Ripper. He is reportedly walking to work, and he sees the body of Polly Nichols. And then a second witness named Robert Pole is walking up behind him in Bucks Row. And then Robert Pole approaches Charles Lechmere, and then they see the body. Some discussions happen, and then they decide to continue down the street, and they ultimately run into P.C. Jonas Misen, and they inform him, and then he goes back to the body of Polly Nichols. And then there's a different officer already on site, and that's P.C. John Neal. Now, as far as the actions and the conversations that Robert Pole and Charles Lechmere had, they were thinking about propping up her body. It's Robert Pole who makes the decision that let's try to lift her up. Maybe she's just drunk or something like that. Let's see if she's okay. And Charles Lechmere is the one who says, no, let's not do that, or something to the effect of, no, he wants nothing to do with that. And we have obtained this information because not only did they talk to P.C. Jonas Misen, but they also went to an inquest and all of this stuff was hashed out. And Christer Holmgren says, a few points. You say that there was blood on the body that could have caused the unwillingness to prop up Polly Nichols, but both of the carmen, Robert Paul and Charles Lechmere, said at the inquest that they saw no blood, and the supposition that it was too dark to do, and the supposition was that it was too dark to do so, so the blood played no role in this. Now, when I did those episodes, I do have to offer one correction absolutely without anybody bringing it to my attention. I've even corrected myself for this in the past when I said that there was some statement that I had misinterpreted in the past about how Bucks Row would have been a rather well-lit street, and in fact it was not, because, again, when I was doing that episode on Peter Foreman's Jack the Ripper, it stated that there was only one single lamppost on Bucks Row, so it would have been a very dark street, and I apologize. And I made that error. Now, the second part here, which is something that Christer Holmgren is really going to want to challenge me on, and I think that a very large portion of his essay-length comment is discussing the actions and activities of Charles Lechmere as he is looking at the body. What I said in my very first episode was that Charles Lechmere perhaps did not want to raise the body of Polly Nichols if he didn't want to injure her further. Like, if she were indeed injured, he might not want to raise the body because that could cause a greater injury. And there's actually a little bit here that Christer Holmgren has written out. You return to the blood later in your presentation, but I can only tell you that it is a fact that both Carmen denied seeing any blood or physical damage. It may seem impossible until we find out that the wounds on the body were simply hidden from sight. That could only have been the killer's work. When Paul arrived at the site and followed Lechmere across the street, the woman's clothes were down over the abdominal wounds and hiding them. The clothing was level with the hips and thighs, and there was no blood on the front of the clothes, as per the inquest and findings. When P.C. Neal arrived and shone the light on the body, he saw a gaping wound to the neck, but my assumption is that this wound was also hidden by the killer. But when Robert Paul pulled the clothing down over the victim's knees before he left, I think the wound was revealed. All right, I completely can grant him that if I made that mistake, that the blood would have been visible in any way to Robert, Paul, or Charles Lechmere if that did not happen, because that was not even an episode of Ripper Wednesday. I used to do a segment called the Anything Goes Friday segment here on Black Box Online Radio, which went for about 3 years, and then I switched over to doing different things like Cooper Friday, but I did an episode just about Charles Lechmere as a Jack the Ripper suspect, and I've been talking about Jack the Ripper a lot on the Anything Goes Friday. And the very first episode of Ripper Wednesday that I did was when I was discussing my part 2 of the Charles Lechmere episodes, and I was very new to the material, and a lot of people wanted to challenge me on this. And I have already admitted multiple times in this episode that I got some information wrong. But here is a point where I don't completely understand the challenges, or here's something that I genuinely stand by, and that is that I don't think that it's beyond belief that somebody would not want to touch the body of an unconscious person out of the fear of injuring them more severely, guilty or innocent. I mean, it definitely innocent. I mean, what Christer Holmgren is trying to say is, if Charles Lechmere were guilty, then he wouldn't want to raise the body of Polly Nichols because he knew that her throat had been slit and her head would fall back and it would be very gruesome. It would make an enormous mess and it would cause an enormous calamity. What he wanted to do was to get away from the crime scene. So that's why he wouldn't have done it. But the second point is that, if he were innocent, hypothetically, if he were innocent, then some people would have the instinct not to touch the body. And I was challenged in some ways when people were saying, Ned, in your first episode, you're talking about 20th century first aid courses, about what they tell you. Don't touch someone if you aren't completely sure if they're injured or not. And I was like, all right, sure. Charles Lechmere would not have been familiar with 20th century first aid. It would be impossible, right? This is 1888, the 19th century. I grant you that too, but just based on human instinct alone, I think that instincts go in two different directions. Some people would have the instincts to grab the body, like Robert Pohl. Other people would have the instincts hold back. No, let's not disturb her like Charles Lechmere. So I really think that there's only that's only about a 50% in chance. And I also think that it's not impossible that people would be thinking like that, that someone's going to be thinking and just, if you touch the body of an unconscious person when you don't completely know what's wrong with them, you could be causing more problems, even if it's not physical injuries. But that is one point where I do stand by. Now, the next biggest issue that I was discussing about Charles Lechmere that I am challenged on by Christer Holmgren is that Charles Lechmere goes to this inquest after the murder of Polly Nichols, and he doesn't use his legal name Charles Allen Lechmere. He uses the name Charles Cross. That's why when I did my second episode, the Q&A session on him as a suspect, it's called Jack the Ripper Suspect Charles Cross. And you can hear both of those episodes here on Black Box Online Radio, Suspect Charles Lechmere and Suspect Charles Cross. And I also didn't think that there was anything completely abnormal about that. So let's look at what Christer Holmgren had to say. You then say that the name swap is not any sign of guilt, be that as it may. The point that I and Edward Stowe make is that Lechmere is recorded as having been Lechmere and using the name Lechmere in all sorts of contact with the authorities. There are 100 examples of it. There were only 2 occasions when he called himself Charles Cross. Strangely, both of them were in combination with cases of violent death where the carman played a role. And by carman, this would be somebody who was transporting different types of goods and so on cars or carts. At least not even if he decided to call himself Charles Cross. Then why did he keep his registered name, Charles Lechmere, from the police at the inquest? Okay, if that's a challenge question. Now, Charles Cross got his name Cross from his stepfather. Cross was his stepfather's last name, and his stepfather was connected to the police force. And the critics of this particular type of theory are stating that perhaps he was just trying to be on good terms with law enforcement. And also, if he's used the name Charles Lechmere in the past with the authorities, was it as severe as this? Was it dealing with a murder investigation? Was it dealing with not only with the murder of Polly Nichols, but about 3 weeks earlier we had the murder of Martha Tabram, which did cause a panic. And that's one of the first things that I learned about the world of ripperology, is that these crimes were widely reported on, these crimes were widely discussed, and I mean, this is someone who perhaps does not want to avoid suspicion, or he wants to avoid suspicion on himself, so he's using his stepfather's name to try and see if anybody is just going to be on good terms with him because he had a family member who was connected to law enforcement. I don't think that that's beyond belief. Now, that you're also talking about how there is this issue when he had another suspicious circumstance and there was another violent death. Okay, well, I mean, it sounds like it's the exact same story. He's using the name Cross because he's just trying to smooth things over. Now, as far as the actions and activities of Charles Lechmere, I'm not a psychic, I'm not a mind reader, I don't necessarily know what people were thinking. What I am simply doing is providing some alternative possibilities. Christer Holmgren continues, if the motive were sinister or not, there is clearly an anomaly involved. One more thing that you say is that there was more blood on the Liz Stride scene than on the Polly Nichols scene. Ditto was that the Stride victim was not strangled. But you forgot that Nichols had her abdomen very severely cut, and that Dr. Llewellyn, who examined Polly Nichols, was of the opinion that the abdominal wounds preceded the neck wounds. Plus, he added that the blood from the abdominal mutilation sank into the abdominal cavity. This explained why there was relatively little blood at the neck, and Stride only suffered the neck wound, meaning this would have been the only exiting channel. And again, I apologize if I've misstated anything on an episode that I did even before Ripper Wednesday started as a regular segment here on Black Box Online Radio, and I do make mistakes because I do not know everything, and I can always accept corrections. But it's my understanding that Liz Stride was cut very quickly because the Ripper realized that somebody was coming, perhaps even heard the footsteps and of the horse that was pulling Louis Doomschutz's cart. and he cut Liz Stride's throat. And much as Christer Holmgren's analysis here could be spot on, that there was one exiting channel for the blood, and I believe it was the interview that Christer Holmgren did on the Jack the Ripper tour channel with Richard Jones when he stated that the blood that was pooling out of Polly Nichols' body was actually done by gravity. I think he says gravitational forces because for just that reason, she wasn't cut while she was standing, and then the blood just kind of sprays everywhere, arterial spray, because she was not strangled, so the heart was still beating. And then there was only one exiting channel, whereas with Polly Nichols, even if she wasn't strangled first, then if she's stabbed in the stomach, then there is going to be blood coming out of multiple exiting channels. She's going to be stabbed in multiple places. Now, other people responded to my episode over the past 2 years, and somebody had a big talk with me once about how they thought that Charles Lechmere was Jack the Ripper. They wanted to address this blood evidence, and they stated that their explanation was that he's walking to work, and he may have had 5 to 8 minutes that are unaccounted for before Robert Paul arrived. And just look at this scenario. Charles Lechmere is by himself in the pitch dark, more or less, sees Polly Nichols in a vulnerable place. He removes his overcoat, he removes his apron that he would have used as a carman, and he removes his gloves. He commits the murder and stabbing Polly Nichols, and he hears the footsteps of Robert Paul, or maybe at this point he's already putting his coat, apron, and gloves back on. Then he hears the footsteps of Robert Paul, and he decides to stand in place and pretend like he's a witness and he just discovered the body. And somebody else, a different person, even wrote into the comments section on the first episode saying that they expect that someone who was a sociopath or exhibiting sociopathic behaviors and tendencies would try to talk their way out of it before resorting to physical violence, because they're like, he's not going to try and murder Robert Paul unless it's absolutely necessary, even if he had a knife on him, even if he is already fueled with adrenaline from committing the murder of Polly Nichols. Someone who is sociopathic, which I believe the Ripper was sociopathic, is going to try and just be like, oh, I don't know what's going on. They want to talk their way out of it. It's part of the manipulations that sociopaths do. And the people who are skeptical of Charles Lechmere being Jack the Ripper would just say that somebody has to find the body. I mean, just because person X found the body, it doesn't mean that person X is the killer. We have people who are finding the other victims' bodies. I just mentioned Louis Deemschutz. He goes on to become a suspect, and he's part of the theory involved in the book Sherlock Holmes in the Autumn of Terror by Randy Williams, and perhaps it's even fair to say that Louis Deemschutz is his suspect, although he would have had 2 accomplices, Isaac Kosabrodsky and Samuel Friedman. And then the alternative is that at the murders of Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, and even Catherine Eddowes, just that the Ripper committed the crimes and then snuck off into the shadows, and nobody saw him. Like with the Nichols murder, for example, Jack the Ripper committed the murder, and then he heard Charles Lechmere approaching, not Robert Paul, but Charles Lechmere, and then he would have ran through a place called the Woods Buildings, and then just more or less through the alleyways of Whitechapel, and then that's how he was able to avoid getting caught. And I think that there are a lot of people who are of the opinion that the Ripper is just somebody who got very lucky and ran away before any of the other witnesses happened, and it's going to be someone who's just completely off the radar. And I mean, that's there is a certain defendable aspect of that theory, but that's almost just saying, I don't know, and you can always play the I don't know card in an unsolved mystery, but it's not the most productive and practical theory. Now, I want to continue with the comment that was made by Christer Holmgren, and I'm actually going to jump into something here. And he says, if you want to rate Charles Lechmere as a 5 out of 10, that is your prerogative, of course, but you must consider the whole picture before you make a decision. And with the Zodiac episodes that I do every Monday, Zodiac Monday, I often give the suspects ratings on a scale of 1 to 10, and I haven't done a lot of that here on Ripper Wednesday. I did a direct response to John J. Edelston's Jack the Ripper and Encyclopedia, and he rated suspects on the level of 0 to 5, and I did one episode last year in 2023 where I ranked the suspects as just high level, mid level, and low level, and this was done about 2 years ago, actually, when I made these episodes on Charles Lechmere, and I'm quite surprised that I would have only ranked him a 5 out of 10. I mean, those were my initial impressions of the story and the initial impressions of the suspect profile. So, in fact, I think I would rate him much higher than that now. I mean, definitely at least a 7 or an 8. Because when I did the suspect ratings episode last year, I put him as a high-level suspect. And I do genuinely think that because of Christer Holmgren, because of Edward Stowe, because of all of these observations that they made. Like, somebody responded to my episodes, for example, and they asked the question, well, wait a second, why is everybody zoning in on Charles Lechmere as a Jack the Ripper suspect? Could Jack the Ripper have not been Robert Paul, who then committed the murder and then walked away and then came back? And my simple response is, according to Charles, I guess, yes, according to Charles Lechmere, that wouldn't be possible, but also according to Edward Stowe on the House of Lechmere channel, that would be impossible based on the information that was shared in the inquest, because Charles Lechmere should have been the one who was walking 5 to 8 minutes ahead of Robert Paul, and you would then have to make the assumption that Robert Paul has just been lying the whole time and that he committed the murder and then he's walking about in some type of half-circle way around, when it appears by all other accounts that Robert Paul is 5 to 8 minutes behind Charles Lechmere on the walking path. And I mean, I just don't think that Robert Paul was Jack the Ripper for those very reasons. Now, as you see, I have a lot of doubts. I have a lot of skeptical reasons to challenge the Charles Lechmere narrative, but absolutely, I would rank him as a higher suspect and a high-ranking suspect. And one thing that I do here on Black Box Online Radio is that I explore possibilities. And do you ever just have those moments when you're reading a book or watching a movie or a documentary and you're thinking, hey, wait a second, is that really true? That's what I do here. And I ask questions and I explore things. But okay, I think you get the idea. Now, continuing on here, Christer Holmgren says, if you have not read Cutting Point, you may want to do that, and you may want to find out about how the fourth victim in the Thames Torso series was dumped in September of 1889 on the exact street where Lechmere spent his formative childhood years. You may also want to find out about the torso that was dumped in a railway arch, and in that order, in order to build the arch, the building where Lechmere's mother and her third husband had lived had been torn down to make way for the railroad arches. Plus, you may want to know that on the day after that the body was dumped in the railway arch, a bloody apron and rag was found at the construction site of St. Philip's Church, up at London Hospital, quite close to the Bucks Row murder site. Last but not least, you may also want to know that the St. Philip's Church was situated on an exact line between the railway arch and where the body was dumped at 22 Delverton Street, where Lechmere lived. Now we're talking a little bit about the Thames Torso killer, and, as I said, I went back and I listened to Christer Holmgren on the Jack the Ripper Tour channel earlier today to revise a little bit, because it's been about 2 years, and my immediate impressions of the Thames Torso killer being Jack the Ripper, no matter whom it was that almost certainly not. The Thames Torso killer is going from, well, I mean, we don't necessarily know, it's all across the 1800s, but let's say 1887 to 1889, and the victims were dismembered, and some of the remains are even buried. And I was like, what? Jack the Ripper didn't dismember the victims in that way, and he didn't transport large portions of their bodies. Jack the Ripper left the victims where they were, and this is even what I think is more important than looking at dismembering versus mutilations, looking at dismembering versus disemboweling. Jack the Ripper really did not try to conceal the remains, whereas the Thames Torso killer did. This is very important for psychological profiling because it makes one killer look like he is higher in neuroticism and one is lower in neuroticism. Someone like Jack the Ripper would have been lower in neuroticism than the Thames Torso killer. But as I said, it's been, after about 2 years just watching Christer Holmgren talk again, I think he made some very strong points about the Thames Torso killer also being Jack the Ripper, just about the likelihood that you would have two serial killers operating in this very grotesque and gruesome way. And also, there could have been different reasons why the killer chose to mutilate the bodies and transport the remains, whereas in some situations he did, some in situations he did not. Could have been done for practical reasons. It could have been done because he murdered them inside and he couldn't leave the bodies in those specific areas, so that's why the Ripper would have had to have moved the Thames torso bodies. And again, like I said, I'm giving credit where credit is due. There were some strong reasons. Now, here's one where I'm not exactly on the fence, but it's something that I will challenge as well. When Christer Holmgren appeared on the Jack the Ripper tour channel, he stated that he thought that Jack the Ripper would not have liked the idea of another serial killer operating at the same time because he believed that Jack the Ripper was very narcissistic. So if you also had the Thames torso killer operating, these things are coming into the news about the Goulston Street torso and this about how they're finding these different body parts and there are just these two serial killer stories going on. I think the exact quotation is Jack the Ripper wouldn't have liked that one bit. That's what from Christer Holmgren. So Jack the Ripper didn't say anything about the Thames torso murders. He didn't try to take credit or take credit for them or not take credit for them. And he thinks that the Ripper was so narcissistic that he would have made a statement about it if he didn't do it, and so on, or just trying to put more attention onto himself. And I think that there is, a twofold response to that. Number one, that is very suspect relevant. That is very suspect profile relevant because maybe your suspect is English, like Charles Lechmere, but a lot of the Jack the Ripper suspects are foreigners, and some of them are coming from Eastern Europe, and they might not have even been aware of what the media was truly saying about Jack the Ripper. Because even if they could speak a little bit of English, even if they could speak English reasonably well, that does not mean they could have comprehended what was in a newspaper. And I really do mean this, and I'm basing this on a little bit of first-hand experiences, but just because you have a minimal understanding of a language and you can have a conversation does not mean you can comprehend the text of a newspaper as well as being able to get the emotions that go along with it. So if you're looking at a suspect like Aaron Kosminski or Severin Klasowski, or maybe even one from Germany like Karl Feichenbaum, then they might have just dismissed whatever the media was saying about them, and they wouldn't have thought twice about a different serial killer coming into the news. Maybe the Ripper was so focused on himself. Now, I would expect, no matter who your Jack the Ripper suspect was, if he had any type of cognitive function and awareness of his faculties, he would have known that the media was reporting on him because other people would have been talking about it in any language, whether it's Polish, German, or Yiddish, and so on. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he is going to care about the opinions of a newspaper that he cannot read himself. And then the next one is that there could also be just something where Jack the Ripper might have just been trying to do this for his own reasons. Like, he might have had his own reasons for murdering the women, and he isn't necessarily going to be caring at all about bragging about this. And what I'm trying to say is some people believe that Jack the Ripper did not write any of the letters. And there is even a third element to this. Okay, let's look at this possibility, because this is a theory that comes up very frequently, and I think it's a pretty good one. I don't believe that Jack the Ripper wrote any of the letters, but I think out of any of them, the one that has the highest chance of being authentic is the From Hell letter. What are the reasons for this? Somebody is committing these murders. He is murdering, like, Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, and then Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes. But after the double event, we already have two communications that are widely discussed and highly thought of as being authentic communications. The Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jackie postcard. And somebody's just thinking, hey, wait a second, I'm not the one writing those letters. I mean, that's not me. They could have been hoaxes that were created by the Central News Agency or by a newspaper called The Star. So what the Ripper decided to do was, he had the kidney of Catherine Eddowes that he had stolen from the murder site. He cut it in half and then he mailed it in with the From Hell letter to George Lusk. He's like, well, if people are going to pretend to be me, then I'm going to write my own letter, and here's half a kidney to prove that I'm actually the killer. Because, I mean, that's just like, that is the narcissistic stuff that I think Christer Holmgren is talking about, partnered with a practical element. Once again, I do thank Christer Holmgren for writing out his very lengthy and extensive comment and sharing a lot of feedback. And it's hard for me to believe that it's been almost 2 years since I started Ripper Wednesday, Of course, I've had some gaps, and there was a little bit of a hiatus, and not every Wednesday I've turned out an episode about Jack the Ripper, but yes, that was started about 2 years ago, and time goes by fast, and I mean, 2 years ago, like I said, that was the very first episode of Ripper Wednesday, and a lot has changed, and now I'm definitely more engrossed into the world of Victorian Whitechapel and pulled into it, so I definitely think differently. And as I said, I do think that Charles Lechmere is a strong suspect, and I do think that there are reasons to suspect him of being Jack the Ripper. I have my doubts, but I do appreciate everything that Christer Holmgren and Edward Stowe have put forward, and in addition to the sources that I've stated, Christer Holmgren also appeared in a two-part interview on the House of Lechmere channel where he was interviewed by Edward Stowe. I did watch that one as well and recommend it to you guys. And you can also just hear people sharing things about Jack the Ripper and their ideas and their stories about how they became familiar with the world of Ripperology. And thank you so much for listening to this episode here. I am your host, Ned DeHaan, Black Box Ned. You can get me on Facebook under my name, Ned DeHaan, BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram and TikTok. And for larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@AOL.com. And I will see you guys on Friday for an episode talking about D.B. Cooper Friday, here on BBO War. That's all for me. Until next time.